So the last video in this slide is now really getting more into that concept of gene pools. So we have brushed on this, and I think I talked about it in the first video, so hopefully this is just going to re-emphasize the importance of being able to understand it and use the right type of language when referring to gene pools and understand the impact of the amount of genes that exist within populations. So what we're going to have a look at is, we want to first define what it means to be a population. Really, that's probably the important part. Individuals of the same species that live in the same area can be defined as a population. I use the example of all of the people that live at EFS would be a population of the same people who live at EFS, that go to EFS would be a population of the same species that all go to EFS. And so if we then look at that same communal area, we can say that a community exists with different types of species that all exist in that same area. So that's that distinction between community versus population. Community is still the same geographic area, however we've got different species that exist there. And then we look at an ecosystem, so we're still looking at that same particular area, but now we're looking at potentially expanding that a little bit to other parts of that area, so different communities as well, and other things like the non-living and the living things that exist within that same particular environment. So this idea or this concept of gene pools is really focused around populations. So when we talk about gene pools, we're not talking about Homo sapiens as a whole species, we're talking about Homo sapiens that might exist in a given population. And so that's going to dictate whether that species in that given area is able to survive and thrive in that given area. So a gene pool refers to the total number of genes that exist in a given population. So in the same species, in the same area, all right, which is the population, the gene pool is the total number of genes. Now, having more genes and more diversity of genes, which is a key thing, will allow us to have a potential higher likelihood of survival overall within the population. So if there is more diversity of genes that exist in the gene pool of all the people at EFS, then if there was going to be something that would cause some of those genes to be removed, which we're going to talk about selection pressures in a second, overall, the likelihood of that species that exists at EFS at that time is going to be likely to be able to survive and thrive. All right. A smaller gene pool within the population has lower genetic diversity because there's just less genes overall, and so there's obviously going to be less diverse range of genes. And so when selective pressures actually come into place, which we'll talk about again in a second, the likelihood that the whole population can survive is lowered. All right. And selective pressures. So a selective pressure is something that will cause a stress on a gene pool, a stress on a population, or a stress on an individual species. And so selective pressures exist naturally, we can't get away from them, but really thinking about selective pressures, you might think more so about a change in a selective pressure. So when a change in a selective pressure actually occurs, that's when we start to see natural selection taking place. And so that's when favourable genes become more characteristic in the environment, because favourable genes allow for that change in the selective pressure to then go, all right, do you have the genes that are going to allow you to survive, or are you going to die off? Now, why a larger gene pool matters is because there's a higher likelihood that favourable genes that exist, and so there's a higher likelihood that certain individuals within that population are going to be able to cope with the selective pressure, and therefore they're going to be able to continue to reproduce in that new environment. And so a selective pressure might be competition for resources that naturally exists, but when we increase the amount of competition, that's a change in that selective pressure. It might be things like disease or an outbreak of something. COVID-19 is a classic example of a selective pressure, and if every one of us was exactly the same and all of us were susceptible to COVID, then as a species we would die off. So it's really important that we have that genetic variation in populations or as a whole species. And so very last thing that I'll just get you to have a look at is what happens if there is low genetic diversity here. And you can see here that Tassie Devils experience that. and there's disastrous consequences.